circumstance where we're in class and the assignment's due tomorrow rather than already due, I thought I would answer a few questions that I've had so you can all benefit. And also I find when I get a question more than once, it means there's probably even more than 2 people that have it. So the multiple question I had to do with folks who are finding the same exact statute section they found on Lexis and on Westlaw and plain language and terms and connectors, and is that okay, or they seem to be, a couple of people seem to be concerned about that, and the short answer is it's totally fine. The long answer is if you find a section that is relevant to your client, then that's the section you go with. If you're finding it in multiple different ways, it probably means you're doing a similar search, which is fine, because if you're finding stuff that's relevant, that's the point. Another question I had to do with the question asking you about web research for the federal code. And the confusion was how I asked the question, and so I figured if one person was confused, some others might be. And what I'm asking you here is, in what situation would you want to use the web for statutory research? What I'm meaning really is a free website. I realize Lexis, Westlaw, Bloomberg are also on the web, but what I'm referring to there is a free website. Also, another question I had, someone was having difficulty just with the search terms finding relevant statutes, and I suggested try different search terms, but as I was thinking about it, another related suggestion is to, sometimes it's good just to simplify your searches. A lot of times people get sidetracked, myself included, if you try to put in too many search terms with too much structure. Sometimes just a couple of words with a simple connector, or just a couple of words plain language, just that is the heart of your issue, might help you get out of that logjam. So those are the several that came up for me. Anybody else have assignment questions? Okay, I will be available through tomorrow in case you do. I will now move on to or rather back to legislative history. We have a couple of handouts up here if you haven't picked them up yet. I'm going to finish up because we did not last time get to bill tracking. Hopefully you remember, I mentioned you will be doing 2 types of legislative history research, and we spent all of last class on the first and more difficult type of research, which is searching for legislative intent, what the legislature meant by whatever language they adopted in their statutes and their codes. But the second type is bill tracking, which we didn't get to talk about last week, so I'm going to talk about it now. And that's, unlike legislative intent, it's really super easy. So on the federal end, we'll start now, and then we'll take a look at state in a little while from now. So on the federal end, I'm going to start with the best first. Basically, it is super easy to do on the free web. So we're looking at govtrack.us, as you can see. Again, the links, by the way, that I'm talking about are on the course website in the legislative history module. This one as well. And the nice thing about GovTrack, and I think Yaroslav, you had asked about it a long time ago, I didn't forget, this is the answer to your question, is if you are interested in tracking particular federal legislation, this actually allows you to track. You give them your email address and probably some other basic information, and they will let you know when there are changes to a particular piece of legislation. So I have up here an area that I know a couple of you are interested in, the Regulate Marijuana, having to do with marijuana legislation. So if you were interested in this particular bill, you could track it here. You could do research in other legislation, obviously, by going to the various links. So you would search by bills and resolutions if that's how you're interested. There's all sorts of information here about congresspeople. This is only federal, this particular site. Voting records and what's happening with particular bills, as you can see. So you can see this particular example, it was introduced back in January and not much has happened since. But as I said, it gives some interesting information. Similarly, on congress.gov, we've been looking at the public laws section of congress.gov, but you can also look at bills, and it's particularly good for current legislation. And again, you get a different representation of what's happened with this particular bill. So those are the two places. Congress.gov would be better if something had happened with this bill and you wanted to look at, say, a report that's been issued or congressional record, debates that have happened. We don't see that here because nothing much has happened with this bill yet. But that's why Congress.gov would be good. And last and kind of interesting, both Lexis and Westlaw have bill tracking. I'm not really sure how useful they are, and since they tend to cost a lot of money and the free sites are really very good, I don't know that there's a huge reason to go there. I suspect the services would disagree with me on that statement. One reason they might disagree, Lexis does have this kind of neat feature where it actually does some data analysis and lets you know what it thinks the likelihood of passage is. So for this same example here, regulate marijuana, Lexis is predicting a low chance of passage. So slightly different reason. If you have Lexis available and this is part of your plan, this is one of those features that could be very expensive if it's not in your plan, it would be interesting to take a look. And again, what you would use bill tracking for if you're interested in a particular area of law and you just want to see what's going on, what changes might happen. You want to see if something is actually pending. We just had big debate in the country at large about funding for a border wall and opening the government, and if you wanted to track that legislation, these, or now of course it's passed, but these would be places to do that. Any questions about federal bill tracking? Okay, so what we're going to do now is to move on and talk about state legislative history. We've gone in depth about federal, and pretty much with state legislative history, the concepts are pretty much the same. The legislative process starts as a bill, goes through the process. If it gets passed typically by 2 chambers in most states, I think there are 1 or 2 states that only have 1 chamber, but here in New York we have an assembly and a senate. So again, pretty much the concept's the same. It goes through the legislative process, winds up, gets signed by the executive. In most states it's a governor, and then it becomes law. The main difference in the states is that there are far fewer documents, which you might think, yay, it's easier, which is fair enough. But it also means that there are far fewer documents for you to find legislative intent, if that's what you need to do with regard to state legislative history. So we will focus on New York, but I am going to show you, if you need to look at other states' legislative history, a place to start. Obviously, we don't have time for all 50 states or even much more than 1, but this is a great site for tracking down guides on how to do state legislative histories in the 50 states. And this picture of this page is in your handout on page 1. And I think if you Google State Legislative History Guide, this would be toward the top. And if you happen to remember that this is in Indiana, then you'd definitely, and include that in your search, you'd definitely get it up close to the top. So as I said, we're going to focus on New York, and pretty much this is a review both of legislative history and a little bit of a review of state statutes, which works out kind of well since we missed that class. So if we go ahead and turn the page to page 2, we see what we saw in the screencast on state statutes, and that's the New York statute that we've been talking about. And as I mentioned in the screencast, New York organizes its code by name rather than number. So where we were talking in the federal code about Title 29 is the labor code, in New York they dispense with the whole number thing and they just call it by its name. So in New York we're looking in our example at the public health law, or the public health code. New York has all sorts of other named codes. public health being just one of them. And just by way of review, and again, because also you're asked on your assignment, in New York we have two codes. We have McKinney's, which is what you will use most of the time. A lot of lawyers just refer to the New York Code as McKinney's because that's what they know. Published by West, which is why you find it on Westlaw. And then the other guys, and they really are the other guys because they're not used nearly as much, is the Lexis version, or CLS, Consolidated Laws Service. So that's how Lexis will refer to the New York Code. And you can see again in print, they're updated either by pocket part, already talked about, so great example, two examples here. McKinney's is pocket part. CLS, the pocket part got too fat, so now it's its own separate supplement. So those are the New York State codes. So if you want to take a look around, hopefully a picture or a book is worth at least 1,000 or 2 words. So going back to our handout, so we see our section 4410 that we were talking about, or I talked about in the screencast. And just by way of review, on page 4, finding the all-important chapter law number. And again, remember, chapter law and public law are 2 different names for, anybody remember? What's the generic term? See if this helps refresh any memories. It's kind of cut off here on the right, at least on my screen, as it is over there. Session law. Does that ring a bell at least? Okay, if you can't. So session law, again, is the generic term. In the federal world, we call them public laws. Remember our hero, the little Bill guy from our cartoon. And in New York, we call them chapter laws. Different states have different names for them. So finding our all-important chapter law works just the same as finding our all-important public law number. You look at the end of the section. So starting here in print, and we'll take a quick look at Lexis and Westlaw in a moment. So starting here in print, we see it's just at the end, and we see, remember we went through the exercise, this section was added when? I heard something.
1976.
1976 by?
Chapter 938.
Chapter 938, exactly. The C, our all-important chapter law, so C 938. And we see it was amended a couple of times, and I've given an arrow to the all-important chapter law number 1996. Now, you don't know why yet. So 1996, chapter 705, but if you turn the page, you will remember, I hope, from last time when we talked about, okay, so we know it was enacted, so we probably want to check that chapter law number, but we also want to see if the language of interest was changed since it was originally enacted. And we do that using the historical and statutory notes. They're called editor and reviser's notes on Westlaw and amendments on Lexis. And again, I don't know why they use different names because it just gets confusing, but that's what we have. So if we had decided, looking at back on page 4, if we had decided that we were interested in subsection 4, that language in subsection 4 is what was relevant for our client. Now, sometimes you'll specify a particular subsection like I'm hypothesizing now, but sometimes it'll just be the whole section. But if you do have a particular subsection, and I look at the historical and statutory notes on page 5, I see that, oh, look, subdivision 4 was actually added by Chapter 705 in 1996. So Subdivision 4 didn't exist when it was originally enacted back in 1976. It didn't come into being until 1996 in Chapter 705. So if I were interested in the language in Subdivision 4, that's the chapter law I would be investigating. If I didn't find my particular subdivision or I didn't have a specific subdivision, I would be looking at the enacting chapter law. Does that make sense? Because that's kind of important. Okay, I don't see yeses or no's, so I'll plow ahead, but please ask if you have questions. Okay, and of course, turning to page 6, we would, in the print, look at the pocket part to see if there were any subsequent chapter laws that were that amended our section after the main volume. And looking at page 7, we would see nothing but research references for our section 4410, and not seeing any text before the research references, we would be able to conclude, okay, there's nothing new in the pocket part, we're good. Okay, any questions? So let's take a quick look at Lexis and Westlaw for these items. And so here we have section 4410. And again, we find out how 4410 came to being and what happened if it was amended under the credits on Westlaw, and we see the same identical information. So added in 76 by chapter 938, amended a couple of times by in these 2 other years. If I want to see what these later chapters, how they amended my section, to see again if my subsection that I'm interested in is mentioned, I would go again to history. We did that federal, so it again works the same way. This is just review. And again, on Westlaw, it's called editor and reviser's notes. And editor and reviser's notes, we'd see the exact same thing. Subdivision 4 was actually added, subdivision 4, in 1996 by chapter 705. Now I have to say, going to Lexis, Lexis is a little bit disappointing in this regard. It works fine for the U.S. Code, and it's called the U.S. Code Service for the U.S., for the federal code, and we see our history here with regard to what happened to our section, what chapter initially enacted it, and the different amendments, but there's no amendments, what Lexis calls the editor and reviser's notes or the historical and statutory notes, at least not in this section, and at least not for New York. I can't speak for other New York sections or other states. I am going to ask our Lexis rep about that because that's kind of important information. This is actually a reference here to prior law. So this is what happened before 1976, which in this instance we're not too worried about. But it doesn't tell us how these different amendments changed our section. And I don't know why Lexis is missing that information. What's actually kind of interesting is it's in the Lexis print version, CLS. So that's a mystery to me. At this point, if I ever get it solved, I'll let you know. So the answer to that, sometimes people ask me, do you like Lexis better, do you like Westlaw better? In this instance, not always, in this instance, I think Westlaw is better because it's got the information that we might need. Okay, questions? So as I said, the concepts are pretty much the same, federal and state. So if you understand the process and you understand documents checking, it kind of works the same way in New York. The main thing is, as I like to joke, the names have been changed. It's no protection of anything innocent there, but all that happens in the states, the names are just slightly different. So in New York, instead of having all these different kinds of reports and hearings and congressional record, in New York, they actually kind of make it easy. We only have a couple of things that you need to check. The main thing you want to look for in New York, and this is probably good if you can try to just remember the name. In New York, we call our legislative history New York Bill Jackets. Don't know where they came up with that name, but that's what they call it. And the reason it would be really good if you can remember that name is because the bill jackets for a lot of years, not every year, but a lot of years, are really easy to find online for free on the web. So if you Google New York Bill Jackets, actually this second link, Legislative Bill and Veto Jackets, will be the place you want to go. And if you click on that link, this is where you wind up. And it's just a listing. So as I said, it doesn't cover every year, but it goes back to 1995, which is pretty good. And it gets added to fairly regularly. It's not super up to date, So it goes through 2016, as you can see here. And honestly, for Bill, this is the first place. If you have a New York legislative intent question, this is the first place I would recommend you go. Once you determine your all-important chapter law number, you've taken a look at the historical and statutory notes, so you're pretty sure you know which chapter, or sometimes you need to check both the enacting and amending chapters. So you know what chapter or chapters you need to check. Next up would be here. So if we take our example, we were looking, if we were interested in that subdivision 4, we learned that that's chapter 705 from 1996. And actually, if you turn your page, pages 8 and 9, well, actually stay with page 8 for a moment. 9 is a different site. We'll get there. You see the example on page 8, and so you just follow your nose. So we know it's 1996, so you click on 1996. And the trick here is to remember to click on the legislative bill and veto jackets sub-collection. If you click here on this top link, it just brings you to the same page. I don't know why they do that, but they do that. You'd figure it out eventually. You don't necessarily want vetoes unless you have some specific question about vetoes, but if you're looking just for legislative intent, you'd go to the sub-collection legislative bill and veto jackets 1996 bills. And what you'd get is a listing here of the bills starting from number 1. And you'd need to get to 705, you'd need to scroll down and click on next a whole lot of times. So what I did is I did that earlier, so you didn't have to watch me click a whole lot of times. And then once you got to the right page, you just click on 705. And if all goes well, up it comes. You see this sort of PDF in this window here. This is downloadable, which actually I did again a little bit earlier. And this is a bill jacket, and this is what a bill jacket looks like. So you've got sort of a title page here, and sometimes they reproduce the bill. This one tells us it's missing. And then it gives us letters. It gives us a memoranda with a Senate bill number. It gives us a whole bunch of procedural type of documents. The main documents that you'll look for regarding New York legislative history or New York legislative intent will be memoranda from the sponsor, because the sponsor of the bill will say in a memoranda, which will be in the bill jacket, will say why he or she thinks this is a great idea and he or she is sponsoring it. You'll see possibly a governor's memoranda. You'll sometimes see letters from interested parties. It kind of varies, actually, the different types of documents you'll see. But those memoranda from the legislators and from the governor would be the first place you would look for legislative intent. Sometimes it's interesting to look at some of the other letters, because you could make an argument that the legislature saw this letter and adopted the language or didn't adopt the language, again, depending on what arguments you want to make. But again, the bill jacket is the place you want to start, and frequently will be the place you will be the only place you need to go. So as we saw, the New York site with the New York bill jacket site doesn't have all the years. It only goes back to 1995. There are a lot of legislation that, for instance, our Section 4410 was originally enacted in 1976. If we needed to look at the originally enacted chapter number, this site wouldn't do us much good. So there are a couple of other places you would go. We also noticed on this site it only went to 2016. What if the bill, or the chapter, the chapter law that you're interested in was passed in 2017? They're not quite up to date yet. So the way to solve those problems are as follows. Let's take the more current issue first. So if something was passed in 2017 or later, there's a different website. And I don't know why they separate them out, and maybe someday they'll get their act together and get it all on one site. But right now, the place to go would be this New York Laws website, which I show you on page 9 with a lot of handy-dandy arrows I want to click on. So I will walk you through some of those handy-dandy arrows. And we start here. So I give you the website here. If you Google New York Laws, this should come up. And here we see actually the website of where you would search the New York Code. So this website sort of serves a couple of functions. This is where you'd go if you want to get the New York Code and you either don't have access to Lexis or Westlaw, or you just want a quick free site. You just need to check a section real quick, and you don't need all the wonderful bells and whistles of the annotated code. If you needed to find a later bill jacket, this is also where you would start. And then as suggested here on the handout on page 9, you would go to this lists heading, and we would go to chapters, because we know we're looking for chapter laws, because that's what we call session laws in New York. And then we would indicate, because we would already have our all-important chapter law number. Again, remember, for legislative history research, either federal or state, you need that all-important session law number. So all-important public law number for federal, all-important chapter law number for New York. So we would have found that again in the credits, in the historical and statutory notes. So I just hypothetically came up with a chapter law number here because we needed a recent one. So I would need to tell this site I want to search by chapter number. I have my chapter here, which again I just came up with this randomly. And then you also have to tell this site the year. And as you can see, this site goes all the way through 2019. So if you want real current stuff, this is the place to go. And then I want to make sure to check off these boxes, because what I'm really interested in is the sponsor's memo, but sometimes this other stuff can be of interest. This is also where we would get that bill text if we didn't have it in the bill jacket originally. And then we would go to search. And did I give you? I did give you on page 10 the results of the search and what you would want to look for. Again, the memorandum by the sponsor or the introducer, as it's termed here. And I got to that here by scrolling down. And note they also give you a neat summary of what happened from introduction all the way to approval. So it was signed, delivered to the governor, signed as Chapter 516. And here we see the text of the bill. And here we see that introducer's memoranda in support. And that's all we have here, but it's better than nothing. So questions on New York bill jackets so far. Best place, just Google New York bill jackets and go to the New York, it's called the New York Digital Library, if you run across that, from the New York State Archive Digital Collections. But if you just remember New York bill jackets, you'll get there. And then for more recent ones, this New York Laws site. Now what I am, before we get going, what about the old stuff? How can I forget the old stuff? We're talking about history after all, right? Legislative history. And this was, I am afraid you have to go to the print. Turn to page 11 on the handout, if you would. So who has the Black McKinney's volume? So Joshua, on the spine, what does it say? Just read top to bottom. Does it say the word McKinney's anywhere there on the spine? No, but you were about to say, pardon me? It's on the front cover. Okay, so I am now holding the volume McKinney's Session Laws, the front cover for 1996, the front cover of which you are looking at on page 11. And McKinney's Session Law is very much on the spine, and I'll pass it around in just a moment, says McKinney's on it. And the reason I make such a fuss over this is an area a lot of people, even attorneys who've been out a couple of years, get confused over, because as I mentioned, attorneys in New York frequently refer to the New York Code as McKinney's, because that's what they mostly use, is McKinney's. So attorneys, especially newer ones, come into the library and see McKinney's on the red spine here and pull it out and try to find the New York Code. And then they get all confused because there's nothing in here saying public health or domestic relations or any of the other titles within the New York Code. And that's because this is the session laws. These are the chapter laws. Again, if we go back to our sources handout, these are our chapter laws organized chronologically. session law enacted by legislature. And here in New York, we call them chapter laws in McKinney's session laws, as it says here right on our chart. So people thinking McKinney's, they pull out the session laws looking for the code. And hopefully, as we all now know very well, the session laws are not the same as the code. So I shall pass around volume 1. In volume 1 of McKinney's, we find the session laws. Again, each year starts with volume 1. So that's 1996 volume 1. Every year starts over with volume 1. So if we turn the page for volume 1 to page 12, we see what a chapter law looks like. So here's chapter 705, the one we were talking about that enacted subdivision 4. And turning on to page 13, we see that section 5 of chapter 705 tells us that section 4410 is amended by adding a new subdivision 4 to read as follows, and that's the text of subdivision 4. So this is what the session law looks like on page 13. Now, here's where we get, so that's the session laws, that's what we talked about when we talked about statutes. That was just a brief review. Now we get to the legislative history portion. In volume 2 for 1996, we have the memoranda and any other legislative materials that might be in here. You can see on page 14 the title page, together with other valuable materials from the legislature. So that's a better way of putting it. So we've got other valuable materials from the legislature in volume 2. And those other valuable materials include those memoranda that I talked about. So again, organized by that all-important chapter law number, I can turn the page till I find chapter 705, and you'll see what that looks like if you turn to page 15. The only difference being, of course, on the actual book you won't find my handy-dandy arrows with explanations. So I will start on this side just for change, pass around volume 2 with the memoranda and other valuable legislative materials. I like that. And you'll see on page 15, it tells us where to go to see the text of Law 705. And then it gives us, for 705, the purpose and summary of provisions. We see on the top of the page, that's where 705 materials, that other related materials starts. Turning to page 16, we see a statement in support. And then that continued on page 17 of the handout. And then you notice about halfway down, the whole thing starts over for the next chapter, chapter 706. So that's just to give you a sense of how the book is organized. So for older materials, so if we wanted to go back to 1976, I would need to go to McKinney's Session Laws, the second volume, and look for whatever the chapter law was, the number was. I think it was 693, if I remember the number. Again, from our credits, I would go to chapter 693 in 1976 to volume 2 McKinney's to see whatever they've got printed. Because again, that bill jacket isn't available to us online. There's one other source, again, for older legislative intent in New York, and again, it's only in print, and it's called the New York Legislative Annual. All of this, by the way, lives right near where the New York Code is, so where McKinney's and CLS is, where you'll be going or already have gone to look at the print for the New York Code for the assignment. And these are right there in the same area. We'll be looking at these in a little while when we do a workshop. And so the New York Legislative Annual is the other source for New York legislative intent for older stuff. Works the same way, organized by all-important chapter law number. So you find what your chapter law is, you find the right year, and you turn the page to your chapter for your year in New York Legislative Annual, and you will see page 18 and 19. And sometimes what's in the New York Legislative Annual duplicates what's in McKinney's Session Laws Volume 2. Sometimes it's different. And the only way you know is by looking. So at pages 18 and 19 show us the New York Legislative Annual, and actually even pages 20 and 21. And as I noted in the handout in the walkthrough, that they are not necessarily the same documents as what you find in Volume 2 of McKinney's. Okay, so any question about bill jackets? Any question about if we can't find a bill jacket and we go for more recent or for older? More recent, the New York Law site, older, McKinney Session Laws, and New York Legislative Annual. Okay, so there's one other circumstance we haven't seen because for our particular New York law, we didn't get a reference. But sometimes you will be referred in the editor's and reviser's notes or the historical and statutory notes or the amendments. You'll be referred to a legislative report. Sometimes for major revisions of codes in New York, like the CPLR, New York will organize a commission to make a recommendation, and that commission will come up with a legislative report. What will happen when you're doing legislative intent research is that you'll probably get a reference to that, either in the editor's and reviser's notes, historical and statutory notes. Sometimes you might get a reference from a case. So bear with me while I pull up. If you remember when we first started talking about legislative history, I brought up the Chase Scientific case. And I showed you, I gave you my story that I like to tell myself about the enterprising associate in a law firm who did legislative intent research and came up with the legislative history to make the winning argument. And the legislative history that my hypothetical enterprising associate found was talking about what the legislature did. The revisers noted that the statutes, and so here's 6th report of Senate Finance Committee on Revision of Civil Practice Act 19, and it gives you a full citation to New York legislative document and all of these numbers. So you'll get a reference one way or the other if such a report is part of the revision of your particular section. Where do you find these reports? If they're relatively recent and you're lucky, you will find them on the Assembly website. So we see here Assembly report. So I went to the New York Assembly website, see Assembly reports, and they're not that many. They don't go back that far, but this is the first place I would look. Of course, I would also Google it, as I'm sure you would. I would check all of these tabs, see if it's a Ways and Means Committee, see if it's a particular committee report as opposed to a legislative report. And then if I didn't find it, I would find your favorite library. In all seriousness, these can be, especially the older ones, can be difficult to track down. We here at Hofstra actually have a great collection of them, still difficult to find. Which brings me back to sort of where we started with regard to state legislative history research. State legislative history research is really, really, really super difficult when you're not in the state. So I showed you the site on page 1 for where to go for other states. Another piece of advice I can give you, we talked in the first or second class about research guides on the web. You can find just general state legal research guides on the web. I find, however, they are not very detailed. And if you have a detailed question regarding another state's legislative history, you might want to look for a print research guide. So here is New York's version. If you find yourself doing some intensive, detailed research, you might want to invest in a copy of this. I would say don't do that quite yet because what you find on the web is still pretty good. But that goes into a lot more detail. The other piece of advice I would give you, if you are fortunate enough to be working in an organization that has resources, you can also find someone to do this kind of research for you. They're called the New York Legislative Service. and they can collect New York legislative history for you. And we started with talking about bill tracking for federal, and I will end talking about bill tracking for New York anyway. And back here on the same assembly site where we talked about assembly reports, we see a bill search and legislative info. As you know, I always like to go to the advanced search to give me more options, and this is where I would track bills for New York. Any questions? So I should now, and if I have already, it's worth saying again, and they're actually a really good resource, the reference attorneys at Westlaw and the attorneys that are on the helpline on Lexis. And they are available mostly 24/7-ish. They may shut down between like 2 and 4 in the morning. But they are a good resource. And so for something in the very odd circumstance that you need to find it, you can give them a call. But as I said, the free website that I showed you for the bill jackets and for the more current information on the New York Law site, I think are really much better. All right, so I'm going to do a quick review of legislative history. As I said when we started out, this is the area that a lot of people find the most confusing, and I say that not to intimidate you, but just to let you know if you've got questions as you start the assignment, which I'll have said at the end of class, please ask. What I try to do on this last handout that you picked up is I try to distill everything we've talked about in the last couple of classes into, as you can see, less than a sheet of paper. So it's pretty shortened. So if there's parts of this you don't understand, it's not really shorthand, but if you need extra explanation, but hopefully this will help jog your memories. So as it says there, of course, as I've been saying a whole lot of times, and I do that intentionally, you need to find that all-important public law number. Now, let's focus on federal. And just as I've said a bunch of times, on Westlaw, we go down to the credits, one area lots of people get confused about, which is understandable, is differentiating between the credits and this later information where Westlaw tells us how up to date it is, which actually here it's not. Oh, here we go. Because you see public law numbers in both places. And it's understandable that's confusing. You just have to keep track that on Westlaw, you want to look at credits. And similarly on Lexis, you want to look at the history. Now, this actually is a good point to make as well. So I'm going to 29 U.S.C. 1132, just for something different, because we've been talking about 1144, and 1132 is also of interest to our client. And for a section that has a whole lot of notes of decisions or case notes, Lexis and Westlaw sometimes divide them up. You tend to at least want to start on Part 1 or Section 1. So if you see that divided up, don't get too confused, I hope. Just go to the first part. And once we get there on Lexis, similarly, we'll just go to history. Again, that's what history. Credits on Westlaw, history, Lexis. Lexis makes it a little easier here. And again, here we find our all-important public law number. And again, you'll want to, for overall intent questions, you'll want to look at the enacting public law. If you're interested in a specific subsection, that's when you'll go to the editor and reviser's notes or history on Lexis, or amendments. We're in history, amendments on Lexis, and here you see the amendments and what each of them did. So for instance, in 1132, if I were interested in chapter C10, I'd read through and decide C10 is what's relevant to our client, I would look through these and see what I can find about any discussion on C10. And I might find later on here that public law 110-233. And it's actually a little bit easier to see on Westlaw, so we'll look on Westlaw so you can see what I'm talking about. And on Westlaw, we would go to, again, we would go to our editors and revisers notes if we wanted a particular, see what happened to a particular subsection. Down to the amendments also. And then I would just look in here, C10, there are a bunch of different section or public laws that have done something to it. I would read through the text to see which one is of interest, and then I might decide, again, here, this is what I'm interested in. So here we see C10, and here we see Public Law 110.233. So this 110.233 affected a lot of different subsections, not surprisingly. So, and again, C10 is just a random hypothetical. So once I have my all-important public law number, whether it's the enacting public law, likely it is, or, because it could be both, a particular one affecting a subsection, then my next step is going to be to take a look for intent. Anybody remember which document in the federal world is the best one to start with for looking for legislative intent? I had you write it in capital letters, highlighted in red and stars and all that when we talked about it last week. It's okay to peek back at your notes. That's why I give them to you. Or you could peek at the outline. Yeah. Committee reports. So that's going to be the first place you want to check. Now, I suggested to you as a strategy when we talked last week, the first place I would go is Hein. And the reason that's not Hein, I would go to Hein. That's Hein. The reason I would go to Hein Online is that for particular public laws, not all of them sadly, but for particular public law, for chosen public laws, they have not only pulled together all the documents so you don't have to worry about finding them, but they're searchable. And that's the main reason why I like Hein so much. So I go here to this U.S. Federal Legislative History Library, whoops, and then to the title collection. And I have to log in again. And again, because I already have my all-important public law number, that's going to be, I think, the easiest way to find it. I certainly don't know what the title is ahead of time. And then once I have my all-important public law number, so take my example of 110.233. So there's Congress 110, and then I'd scroll down, but there's no 233. So as I said, Hein Online doesn't have every public law number, which is unfortunate and disappointing. When we looked at Hein Online last week, I looked at 93.406, which is our enacting public law, and that one we did see was on Hein Online. And just by way of quick review, so I went to Congress 93, and I'm just scrolling down to 406, and lo and behold, here's Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA. And when I have a couple of choices, I'll go with the one with more volumes because that's going to be more complete. And then I can do a search. And the other thing about Hein that you need to remember, whoops. So again, I'm using my star to truncate on Hein. And I learned that in the help section. The thing you want to remember on Hein is going to the section type. I mean, you can look at all of these, but there are 81 results. And if I know I want to focus in on committee reports, because as Rebecca reminded us, those are the best place to at least start. You might not end there, but that's the best place to start. So if I go to section type and show more, I get the choice for House and Senate reports. And then I can narrow my choice. You have to do it one at a time for some strange reason, but I can narrow it to both. But for our first public law, I just checked 110.233. Hein didn't have anything, which is unfortunate. So the next place I would recommend going is Congress.gov. And if you don't have access to Hein, because Hein is a subscription database, and as I've said many times, you're welcome to come back. Those of you graduating this year, obviously those of you running next year too, you're welcome to come back to use Hein Online, but if for whatever reason that's not possible and you don't have access to it where you work, Congress.gov you should have access to, because it's available freely on the web. And here on Congress.gov, we were looking at the bill tracking earlier. To get to our all-important public laws, we go here to this public laws link. It's kind of a little hidden, unfortunately. And then again, with our all-important public law number, we just easily navigate. So for 110.233 is one of our examples. And then Congress.gov is pretty good about having all of the public laws. And once you get there, here's 233. You actually want to click on the bill number rather than the public law. So you click on the bill number. And Congress.gov will give you whatever it has. Sometimes it won't be anything. So when we looked at 93.406, it did not have any links for the reports. It just told us what they were, because that was back in 1974. But for something more recent like this one, it has all of these different links. So I can take a look at the reports. And I like to do it in PDF just because it looks better and is easier to read. And I can do a Control F to search. I'm also going to search for a section by section analysis. So you will not necessarily find it all the time. Sometimes you'll see it in the table of contents here, but not always. I can do, again, a Control F and search for section analysis. And there it is. So again, Hein Online, Congress.gov. Hein Online is great because it searches all the documents at once. Congress.gov, you got to click on each one and then do the search, and there are a lot fewer documents, but again, it's better than nothing. If that still doesn't do me any good, then I would go to Westlaw. And again, this, depending on your organization's contract plan with Westlaw, this may or may not be available and really expensive. But back here on Westlaw, now that we've identified our all-important public law number, wherever I see a link to it, it doesn't matter whether that link is here in an editor's reviser's notes or up in the credits. If you see a link, Lexis will bring you to that public law. And again, that's the law as it was passed by Congress, signed by the President. And then within those legislative history materials, for that public law, we can see the reports. And to the extent that Westlaw has it, you can click on each one and do a similar analysis. So I think that one might. So here's that report, part 1. I can scroll, I can do a Control F to look for section, and there we have section by section analysis. And again, the section by section analysis is what it sounds like. Each section of the public law, it will tell us whatever they choose, the report chooses to tell us. So remember, we found out we were interested in section 514 of Public Law 93.406. I would need to figure out which section of this 110.233 I was interested in, and again, that would be in the editor's and reviser's notes. Or actually in the credits as well. So either one of those will tell you. Okay. And if I didn't find it on Westlaw and I had access to ProQuest, that would be my last choice. I gave you the screenshots for that in the handout. And for state, same process applies as you see from the outline. So this is pretty much what you all just did. You got the all-important chapter law by looking at the credits on Westlaw. You could do history on Lexis. From there you went to the historical and statutory notes, also known as editor and reviser's notes on Westlaw. Lexis is a little sketchy as to whether it has that information, at least at this point. You may need both the enacting chapter law as well as an amending chapter law, again, depending if you're interested in a specific subsection. Then you all just looked at the bill jacket. Did you all go to the, I think I had you all go to the assembly site. Let's make sure. Yeah, you all went to the assembly site. And then you all looked at McKinney's Session Laws, Volume 2. I know a bunch of you looked at Volume 1 first, but remember you want to go to Volume 2 and New York Legislative Annual. Any questions? So I managed in the last 15-20 minutes to do what we just did in the last 2 classes. And I tried to put that all on a single sheet of paper. So I'm going to hand out assignment 3. Again, please ask. This tends to be the assignment that I get the most questions on, which is totally good. This will also be up on the website by tomorrow morning. Any questions?